At 11:38 a.m., under a scorching midday sun that offered no shadow to hide in, the truth finally burst out of the Dominion office, and the nation ignited before anyone in power could react. A leaked dossier stamped risk. Extremist Tier 1 revealed that 9 high-risk detainees had been released after their threat levels were quietly downgraded, followed minutes later by an even deadlier leak exposing that the order to alter the assessments had come from Prime Minister Halden's own chief advisor. And by 11:41 a.m. crowds were already swelling outside local councils, voices rising with the heat as someone shouted, "Is this a joke?" before a bottle struck a police shield. The first fracture in what became a nationwide rupture as reports of 6 stabbings, 5 arson attacks, and a metro bomb threat poured in, all tied to individuals who should never have walked free. Tempers snapped. Shoves turned to punches, punches to blades. Riot shields clashed as officers struggled to contain crowds, growing faster than reinforcements could arrive, and one chant cut through the chaos. Halden lied, people died, cementing the truth that this was not a system failure but a leadership collapse that had begun days earlier in a quiet administrative wing where risk files had been secretly rewritten before reaching the Prime Minister's desk. A fact exposed in the morning's leak showing that the original assessments had marked all 9 detainees as critical threats with extremist affiliations and violent histories. Yet the version submitted for approval had been scrubbed clean of warnings and intelligence, a manipulation confirmed by a second leak tying the order directly to Halden's advisor. By 11:20 a.m. internal whispers had started as 3 analysts refused to sign the sanitized versions and one warned that releasing the 9 would bring unpredictable consequences. His message ignored, leading to the Prime Minister signing the conditional release at 12:05 p.m. and less than an hour later the 9 detainees walked free, unleashing a chain of devastation the country was wholly unprepared for. Within mere hours of walking free, the group became linked to a wave of violence spreading across daylight Britain. 6 stabbings, 5 arson attacks, and a threatened bombing aimed at the underground. On internal monitors, red alerts multiplied across the map. Officers questioned why these individuals had ever been considered low risk. Senior staff exchanged frantic daytime calls trying to understand how the system had collapsed so spectacularly. But by the time the truth emerged, it was already too late. The public was about to see the consequences of leadership failure, and they would respond not with confusion, but with fury. The moment the second leak dropped, Britain stopped being calm. It was 1:42 p.m. broad daylight when the Home Office message began spreading across social networks. First as a screenshot, then as a headline, and finally as a roar echoing through every major city. Risk files were altered before reaching Star. 9 extremists were cleared for release under manipulated assessments. By 1:50 p.m., the streets were already shifting. A protest forming in Sheffield tripled in size within 15 minutes. In Liverpool, office workers poured out onto the streets, phones in hand, reading the leak again and again in disbelief. The sun was bright overhead, but the atmosphere had turned sharp, electric, like the breath right before a storm. And then came the consequences of the release. Before police could prepare a statement, reports began stacking at command centers across the UK. 6 stabbings in under 2 hours, 5 arson attacks on residential blocks, a chilling threat against the London Underground, forcing evacuations at several stations and sending commuters fleeing into the sunlight in panic. Platforms echoed with the sound of shouted orders, dropped bags, crying children. The connection became undeniable. All 9 individuals recently released under the manipulated files were either directly linked or adjacent to the unfolding violence. At 2:35 p.m., the first major clash erupted. A crowd gathered outside the Manchester Civic Annex, smashed through the temporary barriers, pushing straight into the police cordon. Riot officers deployed far too late were swallowed by a wave of bodies. A shield clattered onto the pavement. Someone kicked it away. Someone else hurled a bottle. The line broke. Sunlight flashed off metal railings as protesters tore them from the ground and used them to block the main road. Cars were abandoned mid-intersection. Smoke rose from a bin fire ignited near the tram line. The air filled with the sound of chanting. Stmalide. People died. In Birmingham, tension erupted even faster. A group of masked demonstrators attempted to storm a government outreach center, believing copies of arrest documents were kept inside. Flares burned orange against the midday sky. 2 officers were knocked to the ground. One was dragged away, bleeding. The crowd surged over the steps, fists raised, voices cracking with fury. By 3:10 p.m., the chain reaction had spread. Brighton, Cardiff, Newcastle, Glasgow, Leeds, Portsmouth, Norwich. 11 cities in total, each ignited under the same accusation. Police radios crackled non-stop, overwhelmed with calls. Unit down. Shields broken. They are breaching the line. We need backup now. Mounted police in London attempted to push back the swelling mass near Whitehall, but the horses balked at the explosions of light and sound from fireworks being thrown into the air. Officers lost ground along the barriers. Several were pulled aside and shielded by colleagues before the crowd could drag them further. And still, the numbers grew. By 3:45 p.m., the protest movement had become a national uprising. 322,000 people in the streets under full daylight. Their voices joining into one relentless, deafening chant, rolling up every corridor of every city. Starlight. Starlight. People died. The phrase became a drum beat, a verdict, a sentence. Not a rumor of system failure, not a question of bureaucratic error, but an accusation of leadership betrayal. Near Trafalgar Square, a scuffle broke into open violence when a group of protesters attempted to topple a police van onto its side. Officers rushed to stop it. Batons raised but were forced back again and again as fresh waves of demonstrators pushed forward. The clash sent helmets rolling across the pavement. A flare exploded against the side of the National Gallery, splattering red powder across the stone. The sunlight made everything too visible. The anger, the fear, the truth the crowd believed they now understood. By 4 p.m. the senior police commanders issued a nationwide directive. Containment priority. Expect repeated breaches. Expect escalation. But containment was already slipping across the country. Block after block filled with people demanding answers, demanding accountability, demanding the one thing the leaks made impossible to avoid. Who ordered the manipulation? Who decided these 9 extremists were safe? And why was Britain lied to? By the time Starmer's team attempted a response, it no longer mattered. The streets had passed judgment. The daylight itself seemed to testify against the government. This was no longer a crisis of policy. It was a crisis of trust. And from this moment onward, the Prime Minister no longer shaped the narrative. The people did. Inside Downing Street, the sunlight pouring through the windows did nothing to soften the atmosphere. By late afternoon, the government bunker resembled a pressure chamber. Phones ringing without pause, aides darting from room to room, and ministers speaking in clipped panic whispers. Every update, every headline, every piece of footage pushed the mood further towards collapse. The briefing began with a line no one wanted to hear. We have now confirmed coordinated unrest in 11 cities. A map lit up with flashing red markers. London, Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Cardiff, Liverpool, Bristol, Nottingham, Sheffield, Leicester, Newcastle. Each pulsing in real time as new clashes were reported. The numbers were staggering. 322,000 people on the streets, many chanting in unison, others breaking into smaller, volatile groups that police struggled to contain. Starmer sat rigid, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the table as ministers traded accusations. This is not a public reaction, hissed the Home Secretary. This is a full-scale rejection of leadership. We need to release the statement now, an advisor insisted. Silence is killing us. But another snapped back. Say what? That 9 extremists were freed because someone in this building altered their risk files. The room fell into a suffocating quiet. Then came the operational report, worse than anything yet delivered. In the 6 hours since the prisoner's release, Britain had witnessed 6 stabbings, 5 arson attacks, and a credible bomb threat targeting a major underground interchange. Several of the attacks happened during daylight, caught clearly on bystanders' phones. The footage went viral instantly, each clip fueling the firestorm outside. Police commanders reported that frontline units were exhausted and overwhelmed. We cannot hold 11 cities simultaneously, one warned. If this escalates further, we'll lose crowd control entirely. Starmer finally spoke quietly, but with a tremor that betrayed the weight pressing down on him. Find out exactly who ordered those files to be changed, and bring me the truth before the country burns. But outside the crisis room, Britain was already burning, and the public believed they already knew the truth. By late afternoon, The public narrative had torn completely away from government control. What began as scattered outrage online had surged into a coordinated national backlash, fueled by the two explosive Home Office leaks that confirmed what millions already suspected. The system hadn't failed. The leadership had. Across the country, reactions split into fierce and irreconcilable camps. On one side were those who believed the government had deliberately suppressed the true risk level of the 9 extremists, and that the bloodshed now unfolding was the inevitable preventable result. On the other side were groups insisting that the leaks were politically motivated, urging calm, even as the situation spiraled beyond anything resembling order. But online, there was no calm. The leaked memo naming Star's chief advisor as the one who ordered the risk file manipulation spread at lightning speed. The hashtag Starlight People Died surged past 40 million impressions. Infographics, screenshots, voice recordings, verified or not, flooded every platform. When news footage confirmed 6 stabbings, 5 arson attacks, and a tube bomb threat traced back to individuals released under the altered files, the outrage crystallized into something harder, sharper, and more dangerous. Then the protests began. By 3:40 p.m., tens of thousands were already marching across major city centers. By 4:15 p.m., the total had surpassed 322,000 people in 11 cities, a scale not seen since the early 2000s. And woven into those crowds were flashpoints of confrontation. Manchester protesters clashed with a police cordon outside the Civic Centre. Several shields knocked aside as officers struggled to regain formation. Bristol. A line of mounted police was forced to retreat after bottles and flares rained down from a bridge. Leeds. Counter-protesters arrived and a fist fight escalated into a street-wide brawl before riot units intervened. Chants shook every street but one drowned out all others. Starmer lied. People died. International media seized the moment. Commentators framed the crisis not as a bureaucratic failure, but as a catastrophic breach of public trust, the type that reshapes political destinies. By evening, it was clear the public was no longer reacting to policy. They were reacting to betrayal. As daylight spread across a country, still shaking from the night's unrest, analysts arrived at a consensus that cut far deeper than any operational failure. This crisis was no longer about paperwork. It was about power. Every television panel, every investigative podcast, every newspaper column repeated the same indictment. The manipulation of the 9 extremist risk files was not an administrative error. It was a decision made deliberately, authorized quietly, and executed strategically. A former intelligence officer summarized it on BBC Breakfast. When risk assessments are rewritten, that's not bureaucracy. That's sabotage. Experts traced the timeline. The files were edited before being presented to Star. They were softened just enough to justify release. And the second leak confirmed the most damning detail of all. The order had come from Starmer's own chief advisor. That revelation reframed everything. The stabbings, the arson attacks, the bomb threats paralyzing the underground. The 322,000 people filling the streets in 11 cities under the harsh glare of daylight. These were not random consequences. They were the predictable outcomes of a leadership failure. A failure that attempted to mask risk rather than confront it. Political theorists highlighted a chilling pattern. Governments survive technical mistakes, but they rarely survive moral ones. And another in Parliament where MPs demanded an inquiry powerful enough to shatter careers. An analyst from King's College put it bluntly. If leadership manipulates the truth eventually manipulates the country. And as the chants of Star lied, people died echoed across the nation, one thing became unmistakable. This was no longer a question of policy. It was a reckoning. 11 cities remained on high alert, sirens drifting through the afternoon air like a warning the country could no longer ignore. Inside homes across the UK, one question repeated itself louder than any chant. How did 9 extremists walk free because of manipulated risk files? And behind that question lay a deeper fear. If a leader's own inner circle could alter national security assessments, what else might have been altered? What else could slip through the system unnoticed? What other dangers were walking the streets without the public ever knowing? No official update, no accountability, only silence at the very top. This story isn't closing, it's widening. What do you think Britain should demand next? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for the next chapter in the nation's unfolding politics.